I do believe that you all have agendas and you will know what issues will be addressed by our first panel. But let me just introduce our speakers. Dr. Valeria Korošec is one of the most important researchers on the universal basic income. Uroš Boltin will tell us how will this impact our tax system. And Branko Gerlič, who is the secretary of the Slovenian section for universal basic income, will speak about the possible introduction of this income in Slovenia, and he will also speak about the activities of the section. Branko Gerlič will be our first speaker. Thank you for giving me the floor. I will just briefly tell you how this idea in Slovenia came to light. Professor Mencinger has already stated that this is not a new concept in Slovenia. I will make my presentation somewhat shorter. My neighbor, Dr. Valeria Korošec, a couple of years ago published a number of articles in the journal called Mladina, the Youth. And then later some read these articles with great interest, and we established a society for the promotion of humanities called Sophie's Lovers. We decided that in Maribor, this is the second biggest town in Slovenia, will have this section, and therefore we introduced the section for the analysis and exploration of UBI, and I was appointed the secretary of this society and section. Theoretically speaking, as far as I know, the first person talking about UBI is Veljko Rus. I'm speaking about Slovenia. In 1919, he published a book called The Social State and Welfare State. In 2003, Professor Dr. Igor Privec edited the proceedings called Free Lunch for All. And last year, together with Dr. Valeria Korošec, they edited new proceedings, and next to Philip van Parijs' contribution, we also have a number of contributions from Slovene authors, some in favor, some against UBI. We have as many as 26 contributions. Probably many of these contributors are here today. As early as 2005, we had one publication called Dialogue, which also addressed UBI. Unfortunately, the authors are not here today. On the 21st of January 2010, our section was established, and at that time we addressed a number of interesting concepts. We had a number of presentations throughout Slovenia which were organized. There were also a number of meetings. This is the first international conference dealing with this topic. And we also set up our website, so Sophie's Lovers UTD. We'll also set up a forum in a short time, and we will also collect signatures, or at least this is the plan, because last year we also joined the European Citizenship Initiative for UBI. So this will be addressed to the European Commission, and we will ask the European Commission to introduce UBI. Valeria Korošec is a researcher, and in cooperation with our section, she prepared a draft proposal for UBI in Slovenia. She also presented political and economic arguments. We also have one person who completed a PhD and addressed UBI. We also have one diploma thesis addressing UBI. And I believe that in September this year, we reached one important conclusion. We were given the recognition by the Universal Network, BIEN. Namely, Slovenia has now become a full member of this network called BIEN. Thank you very much. So much from me. Once again, allow me to bid a warm welcome. It is indeed a great honor to speak about UBI in front of such eminent experts, especially the people who were the source of inspiration for my work, contributed to my work. So what I have managed to put on paper is, of course, only the result and fruit of all my predecessors who spoke before me today. I also have to tell you that when I started addressing this topic, I felt very lonely, very isolated. The only link with my political adherents was the Bien network, together with its documents. I studied all these papers from all proceedings and all conferences. So it is no wonder that what I will be talking about today is also something you will be able to find in the works of my predecessors, because I believe that our minds converge, we are moving in the same direction, and we are dealing with similar assumptions to start with. Of course, there is also a possibility that in the audience there are some of you who are not familiar with UBI, but still, I will just briefly present the concept today. I will present my draft proposal, and more or less I've been doing that for the last couple of years. So, what are my starting points? My definition of universal basic income is this. This is indeed a certain minimum income for subsistence that is given or assigned to every member of the community based on the agreement of this political community. So this is done on an individual basis, and this is not coupled with any means testing or any other requirements for work. Still, I have to tell you that in the past 2 years, I in fact honed my definition, honed my proposal, and I said that we can have this introduced in Slovenia by taking into account 7 questions. Or rather, we need to answer these 7 questions, and these questions are a never-recurring theme. Maybe for our guests from abroad, let me tell you what was the start of our debate in Slovenia. Whenever we started speaking about UBI in Slovenia, the first initial response was this: it is not feasible, we don't have enough assets, we don't have enough money. Or how should we fund this? Although Professor Menciger quite early in the debate said what he highlighted today, it is quite probable that this is possible, that it is feasible, yet nobody made any calculations. Also, in addition to this, nobody responded to these basic questions. Very well, if it is possible, then what should be the level, what should be the amount of UBI, who should fund this? And this has been also mentioned by Professor Menciger. What will this mean for the system of social security? In other words, before we even start reflecting on UBI, we need to provide an answer to these basic questions. Then, how much money do we actually need to fund UBI? What amount can be paid out? Well, in fact, this depends on who might be our recipient. How many people are entitled to receive UBI? Thank God, in Slovenia, we didn't even start with the assumption that everybody will be entitled to it. But in foreign countries, they often say that children will not be granted UBI, or they even will receive less. Globally speaking, it is often said that children can be entitled to, let's say, 50% or 33% of the total amount awarded to adults. I will skip this, let me continue. So when it comes to Slovenia, when I started reflecting on how we might best address this topic, there was one additional reflection which I had to take into consideration. We need to acknowledge that the Slovene welfare state, especially because we have socialist origins, and therefore it was not a poorly organized state. But when compared to international statistics, we can observe that we are not the worst off. We are quite good on that note. So when you start thinking of whether you might introduce UBI or not, you should know that this UBI should be tailor-made to the system and that should mark an improvement, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to introduce UBI altogether. But that better off, who will be better off, to what extent? And here I in fact revised Rawls's rule on justice, namely that this new UBI system should not threaten those who are most threatened within this current system, and it should be also good for the majority of the population. So these two basic conditions should be met before we even start thinking about UBI. And then, when I made certain calculations on UBI, I learned that in the previous social system, we had such a system for children that in the past 4 years, the situation of children substantially deteriorated and they are worse off. And another thing which I considered when I started thinking about this proposal altogether, I thought that because we are thinking about UBI, well, why then not introduce the ideal solution? So what should be UBI when we take into account the maximum amount? Without searching allowances for children, without allowances awarded to those who are not Slovenian citizens. So let us examine what might this ideal scenario be. What should be this theoretical assumption of an ideal solution? So that it is truly universal, that it is truly equal, that it is truly in line with individualization. So these are all principles we advocate in theory. And once we have these theoretical starting points, we should calculate the amount to say how will this cost, what amount will the cost will be, and then we should also examine what happens to financial means in the Republic of Slovenia. So can we fund this? Later on, I made this chart, I made this calculation, which was my preliminary calculation, and I considered the suggestions by Dr. Veljko Rus. At that time, he published a book and he spoke about UBI. He said that this UBI should be in line with our needs, with our minimum needs, with our subsistence needs, and at the same time we should also take into account income of active population on the labor market. Therefore, the amount of UBI I didn't link to the poverty line, but I made calculations by taking into account some kind of average. So if you calculate what will be 1/2 of this poverty line of minimum living expenses, and then if you also add to this 1/3 of an average wage, and you make this calculation, then my total amount which was awarded was 300 euro. And then later on, I learned that also in the political context, you need to take into account one condition, namely that this should be above cash social assistance awarded to individuals in Slovenia at present. Still, this calculation stems from 2008. However, I fear that this proposed amount of 300 euro is still in line. It is still valid. It still complies with these conditions because in the meantime, average wage was reduced. And cash social assistance, despite this extreme crisis, was not advanced, although this was promised by politicians and this should be implemented, but it was not. Therefore, one thing, I also have to tell you that when it comes to this section and when it comes to colleagues, many people were disappointed because I proposed a very low UBI. It was said to me, how can you propose such an amount? Because it is 1/2 of this poverty line. I will tell you my arguments. This is a matter of personal choice to a certain extent, because I want to have UBI introduced now. I want as much as possible now. I will not wait for about 30 years to be given UBI at the level of poverty line, although theoretically this would be more acceptable. In addition, I work in the organization for which everybody knows where I work, so I work for the Government Office for the Macroeconomic Analysis and Development. So this is an economic think tank of the Slovene government, so to speak. So when I first introduced this concept of UBI, 50 economists attacked me immediately. And in fact, they trampled upon me, literally. So later on, I decided that it might be better to introduce a very simple system which doesn't give room for economists to criticize me. So no change of social system, minimum changes within the tax system, minimum changes when it comes to the level or rather amount of income assistance, so social cash assistance. I wanted to prevent for people preaching me and convincing me that I am proposing something which might give rise to increased instability within the system. So this, in fact, is an experimental approach where you change just one tiny variable, and then this in turn would lead to great consequences. However, it is true that this doesn't mean that the entire system will be shaken upside down, because this in fact can lead to unpredictable consequences, but we want this to be prevented. Therefore, this is a very sparse, very modest proposal, an approach which I took. Then there's also one particularity when it comes to Slovenia, and I was acutely aware of it when I was in München at the World BN Congress. I will skip this because I have already said this. So practically speaking, how this redistribution would take place of this UBI, namely. The majority of countries are thinking along these lines. They speak about taxation. So whether they would tax income tax or other sources of taxation in order to introduce UBI. But I live in the fortress of neoliberals, and any idea about higher taxes is something which is unacceptable in Slovenia and also in the Slovene public. So nobody in Slovenia doesn't believe if you, of course, take something from me, I will not get this back. So this is the main assumption. Therefore, I wanted to introduce such a system where people will see instantly that their money will come to them, will be redistributed to them. Which is why for employed persons and also for pensioners, I introduced the so-called bypass system via the tax administration of Slovenia. So every employer should, in fact, once they pay out wages, and this wage is paid out, should also transfer one amount of the wage in the level of UBI. This should be transferred to the tax administration, and then this will be transferred to the account of every individual. You might think this is a funny idea, but what in fact is the crux of the matter, so where the problem lies, and which problem is being addressed by introducing such a solution? Those who steal wages, thieves of wages. So wage stealers, this is a concept from Canada. Wage stealers, those who do not pay contributions for their employees. So these amounts are not paid out, because what we are seeing in Slovenia is that employers didn't pay out wages. As for the state, those workers who were not paid were referred to the court. But then they didn't have any possibilities to get any money in return. The court system didn't work, and they were existentially threatened, yet the state left these workers out there hanging. This is catch. So if the tax administration, instead of these employers, would pay out UBI, so the state budget, in fact, should guarantee that we would have this UBI on our accounts for all employees, and then maybe the state would react sooner than in 8 years, and they would exert pressure on employers to pay their wages and to pay their contributions. Still, there is one section of the population who are financed through budget, such as the poor, then unemployed, as well as children. Here I made calculations and I determined their numbers, and I also calculated possible amounts for these categories. So I looked into budget items and I learned that the same amount earmarked for these categories of people to allow for their subsistence, and they should be used instead of these social transfers for UBI. The Ministry of Labor in 2008 allocated 1 billion. So if we abolish tax allowances, if we introduce certain changes to the tax system, and the Ministry of Finance made calculations saying that this would contribute to additional 900 million. So together our calculation reveals that if we introduce UBI, financially speaking, we will have a positive impact, or at least financially or budgetary neutral solution. I would like to apologize for taking too long, but what is really important, and now I will really conclude my presentation, I can only tell you that last year I forgot this research ethos, but at the Institute of Economy they made calculations by using micro-simulations and relevant models. They analyzed how the introduction of UBI what would it mean for certain categories of people when we consider different groups, so preschool children, school children, those above 65 and retired. So how much can we trust this model, which was not tailor-made for UBI? Therefore, it was not quite compatible with UBI altogether. The results reveal that we will succeed because the majority of the population would be indeed better off, and those who are threatened the most would be safe and secure if we introduce UBI. But what is the most frightening thought, and I do hope that today we will also talk about this, and also tomorrow. Because in these difficult times, in these times of uncertainty, our institutions which have power, which have knowledge, which have expertise, however, these findings and this evidence was not subject to their response. I don't think much about my calculating possibilities and abilities, yet within a 2-year period, no economists said that I was wrong in my assumptions. Very well, my colleague has certain objections when it comes to my tables, but these are minor remarks. But globally speaking, nobody rejected this hypothesis presented by me. But at the same time, nobody in fact embraced this idea. Why the silence, you might ask? And I have been thinking about this for 2 years. Provided we had a cure for cancer and you're walking around offering this medicine, but nobody in fact takes this on board. Why then? We know. When it comes to health, we have pharmaceutical companies, they lobby everything and they have a grasp over the public. But when it comes to UBI, who has the interest there? My colleague guys standing talk about not merely plutocracy, but those, I don't know, salaries. Well, this category, those who are still on the safe side, who are still warm and cozy, and they're looking down on losers as they were not their brothers and sisters. This cannot happen to us. This is where the problem lies. Professionals, experts, vampires, parasites, because they live on the industry of poor. And sometimes they even provide assistance to make people handicapped so that they will be better off. Because on the other side they will make money and they will have a job, because they will provide assistance to these handicapped people. Therefore, and I really am not the only one holding this opinion, because we have a number of articles on the crux of the problem, because we say that the UBI is not necessary. And the media is something which still reports about that. You talk about the middle class, which is well protected. And I really don't know why everybody thinks they are well protected. And I don't know why they say this is the crux, the core of development. No, it is the core of stabilization, of preserving the current state of affairs. Those people who are deprived are the driving force behind changes. They want to have changes introduced. They understand that the situation is indeed unsustainable. To sum up, last year we compiled a review. Many things have been achieved. Last year we set one objective. We say that we will network internationally. This year we were in Munich. We were embraced, we were supported. Branko was not there, but I cannot find words to express my thoughts and feelings. Our elite, our politicians boast and praise. There are 20 countries within the network. And of course, UBI is being developed in many countries. But let's speak their parlance, their language. Out of these 20 countries, there is also Brazil or Argentina, who are not OECD members. But other 18 member states are those member states which are role models for Slovenia. Or rather, it is said that we would like to go this way. But then we should also follow this path when it comes to the things which really speak for the people, when we talk about OECD developed countries. And this is where our future lies, in fact. To finish off, of course, we will upgrade these concepts. And later on, within our panels, we will speak about European possibilities on how to boost cooperation even further. And now we would like to call upon all of you to say that you will support and will contribute signatories. First, in Europe, we will see what they all know, that they will get what they wanted, namely, they wanted for European countries and for their people to feel European. And we do feel European. Because why? Last year, I said that I will no longer advocate UBI. No way, because in Slovenia, I don't have any response. But I said I will go to foreign countries, I will go abroad, and then I will come back. Because in Slovenia, they only hear and embrace concepts which are heard from abroad. Very well, we will take on this approach and we will speak from abroad. And we will also move into the political battle. We will go to politicians. Because last year, there were about 4 to 6 members of the section from different political parties, and we ran for parliament. Although we despise political parties and political party system in Slovenia, but we come from different political parties. Of course, we failed miserably, But what is our next approach? Political parties are not the right response for us. We'll not go via political parties, because our system of political parties is such that even if you want to do good, you are not given this opportunity, because you cannot embrace powers and needs of people. Therefore, we will collect signatures, citizens' lists. We will have one individual at a state level. We will not use 5 names to attract people, and then 88 so-called candidates will appear, and then in the parliament you will see one person you are not even familiar with, and you don't know this background. No, this is not the approach we will take. But this is one solution I would like to propose to you now. Of course, I'm very much enthusiastic about Guy Standing. He is an exceptional role model, and this also goes for Joža Menzinger. But I think that we need to indeed expand this network, this parlance. We need to know where our development possibilities and paradigms lie, because economists should be marginalized. They should think about what they are preaching and doing. I'm calling upon sociologists. I'm not saying they are much better, but still, I would like to call upon all professionals, artists, psychologists, any people who can contribute to this UBI idea. And I would also like to particularly address women. This is also meant for our foreign guests. Goran Vojnović, our director, our writer, how he responded to UBI, he said this is utopic thought, but he said the biggest problem is this. I would like to have social justice, which might enable competitiveness at the same time. And you know, this competitiveness rests on the principle of a football game. Well, as long as men fight, this is good. But if men do not have enough energy to be competitive, if this is not competition, well, but if we had UBI, if you had 300 euro, if we had this amount, then this is good. And then you can also compete, and then you can be competitive as well. So why not join? I think that men should make this concept clear, whether they really want to fight, whether they really want to compete on the football ground. And now, let me tell you one thing. I gave up and I said that I will no longer be involved in UBI, but ultimately I said, why should I do this? Retired people are not satisfied. They have their pension and societies, and they also have their political party in the parliament and in the government. They should address letters, they should call people. All trade union members who are not satisfied with their head offices, they should also write a letter. Ultimately, people should address their representatives and should approach them. They laughed at me at one lecture because I had one idea from foreign countries saying that we should address the church as well. In the foreign countries, it is not said that the church is a bad institution, but the church can be addressed. And why then not in Slovenia? We should address our church representatives. But then I said, very well, children do not have their own representatives. Well, they have student associations, okay, secondary school students as well, but not children. Well, but this is not the case, because every child has at least his or her mother, and females in Slovenia, in Europe, will say that we will go on a sex strike, or we will not cook lunch. So then we will have UBI at least for our children. I'm not saying that immediately we should introduce UBI for all categories, but strictly speaking, not to have UBI for all children, well, this is indeed tragedy. Thank you. And later on, of course, I will expand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valeria Korošec. This truly was a detailed presentation, Mr. Uroš Boltin. The floor is yours. Thank you. I wish only to briefly add to what Valeria already presented. After such an enthusiastic speech, this rather technical presentation might bore you a little bit. Nevertheless, we need to know what we're counting on and what we're calculating. Valeria already presented what we are talking about in Slovenia. There is a minimum shift in redistribution. Something that will ensure UBI. On the other hand, it will not too drastically worsen the situation for anybody or increase their income tax or anything like that. So the principle that we're following is that everybody who has a sufficiently high income will, in principle, put their UBI back, which is sort of what would happen. The way she divided people into those who receive income and those who don't, we can assess the balance of the state budget, and we see that this is what we're dealing with. Nevertheless, we have to look into the detail of the tax system. So, parallel to her proposal, I dealt with the calculations. So, in the core of the UBI story is proletariat, so to speak, the people who Professor Standing was talking about, people who are not completely without an income, but they are not receiving a regular wage. So one has to look at this transition. If we ask the question, who gives their UBI back and who doesn't, we probably see that not all of them will give it back if they have an average income. The number that Valeria proposed is 300 euros, but everybody who would make 300 euros would have to put it back, and then they are left with something worse. And we come back to Professor Standing's words, 80% of people and then who would have a higher income would be subject to taxation 100%. So I believe that for lower precarious income, we would have some relatively balanced out taxation, for example, 50% or something like that. It would probably be higher than the now income tax, but one has to be left with something at the end of the day. So if, for example, we look at up to the minimum wage of 50% in Slovenia, we know that the minimum wage is something like 560 euros net. So if UBI would be half of that, those with the minimum wage would give it back, and the rest would partially give it back. So if we take this as a tax on income, then this is something similar to the income tax. We are talking about the national framework. I agree with what Professor Van der Ries said, that at the European level we can't operate with the income tax. VAT is probably the most appropriate way of taxation, but if we're talking about the national framework, in the part that compensates for the most of the population, their UBI, then we look at the value-added tax, because this is where we know how much somebody makes, how much they give back, and how much they are left with. 50% of the minimum wage, if this is integrated into the tax scale, then it basically means that we added some additional tax class to what we already have, because now a general benefit amounts to the minimum wage already. So we have some zero tax class for, let's say, 50% tax rate. This would be a model which, for this part of the population with low income, it ensures some transition with some relatively sensible taxation, and it compensates everything for the others. If I attempt to make an assessment for a country with up to 250 euro income, according to the study mentioned by Valeria from the Institute, there are about 700,000 of people that would be in that group. I'm talking about the individuals. This is almost half of the population. We're talking about the individuals who are members of the family, those with higher income, but since UBI refers to every individual, then we're talking about 700,000 people who can't have their own income. Why we're talking about 250 euros and not minimum wage? Because those who have a bit more would give 1/4 back, those who have a bit less will give 2/3 back or something. But we're talking about the effective number that we need to use to multiply it by in order to get the number of UBI. Talking about 250, this is 2 billion euros per year for the state, and this is why we could deduct what we are already intending for that part of the population, which is predominantly transfers from the state budget, and we can also talk about tax allowances for dependents, and then the transfers are also taken into account. The number that Valeria mentioned for the year 2000 was 1 billion euros. Now it amounts to 1,400,000 euros. It's a question of how much we can abolish and how much not. I do not wish to go into any further detailed discussion about it, but we will see how much we can abolish. And ad hoc, we can say half can be abolished. And we come to 900,000 or 1 billion that can actually be deducted. And the rest is a matter of redistribution. So we took 1 billion from the people who are eligible for UBI, which is a compensation, and for the rest, this is not an impact. The question is where we take it from. Valeria mentioned that she would abolish a general tax allowance, and maybe I would have a comment to that. It's not an objection. Her adding up really works, but we took a bit more from the people who have their own income rather than just a compensation for UBI. Of course, to a certain extent, we have to count on redistribution. Without a doubt, these are figures that are not completely out of something that one can imagine. At the moment, we are dealing with a deficit that is much bigger, and we had a reform of the tax to the wages and how much money was taken from the budget in that respect. Nevertheless, the distribution to the in the scope that we are talking about is not an unrealistic one. If we wished to ensure UBI in its minimum scope, this is what we're dealing with. But if we're talking about the distribution within the population, which has somewhat higher income and does not need UBI to survive, and we wish to suffice some economic impacts, and we're looking at the tax scales, and I said 50 and then less and then more, this would be a somewhat temporary solution arising from the current situation. So the question is if one can support it in long term, explaining why this is how it should be. But let me mention something else we need to take into account, which is the labor market, in the sense of corrections of the impact and what is happening. This is definitely a part of the story of UBI, but I'm talking about also reciprocal impact of UBI onto the labor market and flexibility of households. And I would not emphasize the flexibility in the sense of laying off. I'm rather interested in the flexibility of the price of work. Let us leave the just approach and justice aside. We know that there is unemployment. We know that the offer on the labor market exceeds the offer of labor force exceeds the needs. So there is a need to look for the solution and maneuver space for the state to enable to the segment of lower paid working force to have lower or less money, regardless and at the same time, it would not influence their lifestyle. In the next step, further distribution discussion would have to take place. That's all I wish to say from the taxation viewpoint, explaining what one can be dealing with at this point. So that's all I wish to add. Thank you.
Hvala lepa vsem.